The other day I was about to start up a new save of Doom Eternal, but I was stuck on choosing the difficulty. It had been a little while since I played Doom Eternal, and I wasn't sure if I could handle it on its highest difficulty setting at the moment. So naturally, I went to a lower difficulty setting, but then I was worried that I wouldn't be getting the same experience I wanted by lowering the difficulty. So then I started wondering, what is the intended difficulty in this game, and why are there other options then if only one of them is the way the developers wanted you to play the game? This question led me to do some research into Doom Eternal's development. First, I created a Steam forum asking what the intended difficulty was. It received a few answers talking about a no-clip interview with Hugo Martin. So I went over to YouTube, found the interview, and Hugo Martin had a lot to say about this. In his interview, he talks about how when they started moving from Doom 2016 to Eternal, they came up with all these features. First, like the meat hook, for example. Just sort of threw them into the game bluntly. Hugo said he felt like these new tools that they were giving the player made the game too easy, and in turn, didn't encourage the player to use them in the intended way. An interesting story is that when the game was previewed in the gameplay demo with Hugo playing the game, he intentionally went out of his way to play the game in the way he wanted it to be played, even though the game wasn't actually encouraging him to do so. This isn't a common tactic used by studios to promote the game, but what is awesome is that after the demo, Hugo told his dev team that he wants the game to make the player play like how he just did.
Cool, and I was weapon switching and doing all these things, but the whole time I was, I'm like, the game needs to make you play this way. Like,
Right.
I'm going to play this way because this is kind of like a touch point for what we hope to achieve and how the game will naturally make you want to play.
And with that, the intended way to play Doom Eternal was founded. So to answer my Steam forum question, the intended difficulty is the hardest one, Nightmare, because it forces the player to use all the tools and go about dispatching enemies smartly, the way Hugo's team intended. However, the developers were aware of how much of a challenge this would be and included easier modes to make the game more accessible. Now, I could just end the video there talking about Doom. However, after I looked into the background on Doom Eternal, it made me curious about other games that also have a true intended way of play, that have founded clever ways of encouraging the player. Keeping in the trend of first-person shooters, I wanted to take a look at a game called F.E.A.R. and its unique style as well. So when it comes to games with an intended gameplay loop, F.E.A.R. stands out a little. In an interview that Craig Hubbard did with Eurogamer back in 2005, he talks about how he wanted the game to feel like an action movie more than first-person shooters already did. He said he wanted the whole game to feel like the T-Shop shootout scene from Hard Boiled. With this in mind, I thought it'd be a good idea to take a look at that scene from the movie and see if we can draw any comparisons to the final product. F.E.A.R. shows us how an intentional way of play can be part of not just the gameplay but also the presentation as well. The game encourages the player to shoot and move just like that scene from Hard Boiled, through a combination of level design and AI. Now you may have heard before about how F.E.A.R.'s AI is extremely good, even after 10 years later. The AI only works so well because it's lesser mentioned outstanding level design. Similar to games like Doom, the levels you fight in F.E.A.R. are less hallways for bad guys, but more like arenas, meaning there are usually different paths to head through and the enemies will react fluently with your actions. If you go left, the enemies will go left to cut you off, but only if they saw you go left. They will try to cut you off because, keeping in line with the scene from Hard Boiled, the soldiers in this game are very aggressive. They are not content just to wait for you to pop out of a corner or walk in a single file line towards you. They are constantly trying to flank and flush you out, so to counter this, the player has to be constantly on the move in order to. Add in all the smoke and particle effects that the guns generate from the fight, and you got yourself an action movie, both in gameplay and presentation. I would like to talk more about how F.E.A.R has great design, but there are other games I want to talk about, and other YouTubers have already covered this in a much greater fashion than I ever could. So far we have talked about how games will encourage players into a certain playstyle for both gameplay reasons and presentation reasons, but what about narrative reasons? In games it becomes a balancing act of trying to establish a narrative while also not compromising the gameplay. If a game has too many instances where control is taken away from the player to establish an important narrative piece, then the player may become frustrated or just simply bored, because the game has become less of a game now and more of a movie. Now, if the narrative is good enough, this can sometimes work, but usually it doesn't. On the other side, if the game doesn't do enough to establish a narrative, even if it is a good story, it may be hard for the player to focus or even care about it, if the game itself doesn't give enough attention to it. This has led to games looking for ways to have gameplay and narrative be one and the same, which commonly comes in the form of encouraging to play a certain way. If you're trying to tell a specific story that requires the player to take a role of a scared child or a conflicted outlaw in the West, you have to find a way to encourage the player to immerse themselves in the role on their own. The more you force a player to play in a certain way, it can feel less like immersion and more like suffocating. A great example of a game finding a good balance is the underrated game Sleeping Dogs. In Sleeping Dogs, you play an undercover cop known as Wei Shen, as you attempt to infiltrate the triad gangs in Hong Kong. While the game does many things to make you feel like you're part of the role, like eating at food stands to get health buffs, or learning martial arts by going to a trainer for help, what the game does very well is making sure you never forget that you're playing a character that is balancing two worlds. Wei is constantly juggling between proving himself to the triads, while also upholding his oath as a police officer. This is done through a double point scoring system in every mission. Every mission you go on, you will score on both a triad level and a police level. You get points on the triad side by doing things that would impress them, like taking down gang members, using the environment, and just being violent really in general.
Come on! Get back!
While you're doing all this, you're also being judged by the police side as well. Where the triad meter is something that you're trying to fill through your actions, your police meter is something you're trying to maintain by avoiding certain actions. Hurting civilians, damaging public property, are actions that will reduce your police meter. This will always remind the player that despite participation in beatdowns, shootouts, and high-speed chases, they are still an undercover cop. With this scoring system, it makes the player feel like they are in a constant juggling act with their actions, similar to how narratively Wei feels to be juggling his now double life. Now, despite everything I've said so far, all the games I've talked about could be played in an unintended way, and the player would still have an enjoyable experience. Doom may still be very enjoyable on a lower difficulty, F.E.A.R still has many redeeming elements to it besides the John Woo-like style, and Sleeping Dogs is still a fun game without all the narrative elements. But what about a genre of games that are made to be played in such an intended way that deriving from this can completely just ruin the experience? Okay, I gotta put in something to link this to something relevant right now. Okay, so, you know how Fall Guys is the game that everyone's playing right now? Well, Fall Guys, you intended to play the game by not falling, and the game it encourages you to not fall by ending your game if you fall. But then all the game lets you do is falling. Okay, whatever. Joke's on you. Now I can put in the tags. Let's talk about horror games.
Officer, you need help? Stay back, sir. I got this.
Similar to what happened in Hollywood with horror movies, horror games have had trouble standing up on their own. It usually follows a pattern of one day a successful title comes along that makes mainstream attention, and then a ton of copycats attempt to follow that dilute the genre into becoming just a wasteland of cliches. While this pattern can be found in many genres, I think what makes it especially lethal in horror games is that I'd be willing to argue that horror games are the hardest type of game to design in this industry. I believe this because from a design perspective, you have to design a game around the player already being in a fighting state of mind. This fighting state of mind could be then described as the intended way to play the game. So if the player isn't following the intention that everything was built upon, it will just seem lackluster. Take a puzzle, for example. When designing a horror game, a game designer might decide that since the player would be scared in this part of the game, this puzzle should be made easier, since the player's focus won't be exactly perfect at the moment. So an easy puzzle will still prove to be a challenge without being frustrating as well. Now, fast forward to when the player actually plays the game, and for whatever reason, they are not scared. They just see a puzzle that's easy, and they might even just find it straight up boring. Because the player was not in the intended state of play the developers intended, this puzzle that was built on the foundation of you being scared completely falls apart, as well as everything else that was built upon that foundation as well. This is often why good horror games often have this balance of both empowering and disempowering the player at the same time. That might sound strange, so let me try to give a few examples. In the Resident Evil games, you're empowered by giving you a gun to fight back against the zombies and monsters you encounter, but it disempowers you at the same time by giving you a somewhat clunky aiming controls. Outlast empowers the player by giving you ways to hide and evade your attackers, but disempowers you by having these actions take time and being exposed if you're caught hiding. Dead Space empowers you by giving you a metal suit and energy guns, but disempowers you by giving you dementia. The list goes on, but in the end, all this is done to make the player play the game in his intended way of being in a heightened state while traversing through it. For players that can't or just don't want to get into this state of mind, horror games just feel like this slow, clumsy adventure game. So in the end, what does this all mean, and why should we even care? Why does it matter if developers have an intended way for you to play their game? The point I've been trying to get across is that the intended way to play through a game is usually the most rewarding. When a team sets down to make a game and hammers out a way for that game to be played, they do it because they think it will be enjoyable to the player. Developers know their own game pretty well, so usually the path they set up for the player is how you can get the most enjoyment out of a game. In my opinion, good developers know how to make this path somewhat fluid, so players still have a lot of freedom while traveling it. However, at the end of the day, it's always good to remember that the true intended way of play, in the end, is for you, the player, to have fun. On a final note, going back to my Steam forum that started this whole conversation, one user posted, "The intended difficulty is whichever is the most fun for the end user."